The Varieties of Religious Experience, a study in human nature by William James, is here and continued. We are in lecture 8, the divided self, and its unification. Thus, the thoughts by which I meditated upon thee were like the efforts of one who would awake, but, being overpowered with sleepiness, is soon again asleep. Often does a man, when heavy sleepiness is on his limbs, defer to shake it off, and though not approving it, encourage it. Even so was I sure it was better to surrender to thy love than to yield to my own lusts. Yet, though the former course convinced me, the latter pleased and held me bound. There was not in me to answer thy call, "Awake, thou sleeper!" but only drawling drowsy words, "Presently, yes, presently, wait a little while." But the presently had no present, and the little while grew long, for I was afraid thou wouldst hear me too soon, and heal me at once of my disease of lust, which I wished to satiate rather than to see extinguished. Well, perhaps the way of satiating it's not right, but the lust, with what lashes of words did I not scourge my own soul, yet it shrank back, it refused, though it had no excuse to offer. I said within myself, "Come, let it be done now." And as I said it, I was on the point of the resolve. I all but did it, yet I did not do it. And I made another effort and almost succeeded. Yet I did not reach it. I did not grasp it, hesitating to die to death and to live to life. And the evil to which I was so wanted held me more than the better life I had not tried. And that is the rest of that quote from Confessions, Book 8, chapters 5, 7, and 9, abridged. There could be no more perfect description of the divided will when the higher wishes lack just that last acuteness, that touch of explosive intensity, of dimogenic quality, to use the slang of the psychologist, that enables them to burst their shell and make eruption efficaciously into life and quell the lower tendencies forever. In a later lecture, we shall have much to say about this higher excitability. I find another good description of the divided will in the autobiography of Henry Alline, the Nova Scotian evangelist, of whose melancholy I read a brief account in my last lecture. The poor youth's sins were, as you will see, of the most harmless order, yet they interfered with what proved to be his truest vocation, so they gave him great distress. I was now very moral in my life, but found no rest of conscience. I now began to be esteemed in young company who knew nothing of my mind all this while, and their esteem began to be a snare to my soul, for I soon began to be fond of carnal mirth, though I still flattered myself that if I did not get drunk, nor curse, nor swear, there would be no sin in frolicking and carnal mirth, and I thought God would indulge young people with some, what I called simple or civil recreation. I still kept a round of duties, and would not suffer myself to ruin into any open vices, and so got along very well in time of health and prosperity. But when I was distressed or threatened by sickness, death, or heavy storms of thunder, my religion would not do, and I found there was something wanting, and would begin to repent of my going so much to frolics. But when the distress was over, the devil and my own wicked heart, with the solicitations of my associates, and my fondness for young company, were such strong allurements, I would again give way, and thus I got to be very wild and rude. At the same time kept up my rounds of secret prayer and reading, But God, not willing I should destroy myself, still followed me with his calls, and moved with such power upon my conscience that I could not satisfy myself with my diversions, and in the midst of my mirth sometimes would have such a sense of my loss and undone condition that I would wish myself from the company, and after it was over, when I went home, would make many promises that I would attend no more on these frolics, and would beg forgiveness for hours and hours. But when I came to have the temptation again, I would give way. No sooner would I hear the music and drink a glass of wine, but I would find my mind elevated and soon proceeded to any sort of merriment or diversion that I thought was not debauched or openly vicious. But when I returned from my carnal mirth, I felt as guilty as ever, and could sometimes not close my eyes for some hours after I had gone to bed. I was one of the most unhappy creatures on earth. Sometimes I would leave the company, often speaking to the fiddler to cease from playing as if I was tired, to go out and walk about crying and praying, as if my very heart would break, and beseeching God that he would not cut me off, nor give me up to hardness of heart. Oh, what unhappy hours and nights I thus wore away! When I met sometimes with merry companions, and my heart was ready to sink, I would labor to put on as cheerful a countenance as possible, that they might not distrust anything, and sometimes would begin some discourse with young men or young women on purpose, or propose a merry song, lest the distress of my soul would be discovered or mistrusted, when at the same time I would then rather have been in a wilderness in exile, than with them or any of their pleasures or enjoyments. Thus, for many months when I was in company, I would act the hypocrite, and feign a merry heart, but at the same time would endeavor as much as I could to shun their company. O wretched and unhappy mortal that I was! Everything I did, and wherever I went, I was still in a storm, and yet I continued to be the chief contriver and ringleader of the frolics for many months after, though it was a toil and torment to attend them. But the devil and my own wicked heart drove me about like a slave, telling me that I must do this and do that, and bear this and bear that, and turn here and turn there, to keep my credit up, and retain the esteem of my associates. And all this while I continued as strict as possible in my duties, and left no stone unturned to pacify my conscience, watching even against my thoughts, and praying continually wherever I went. For I did not think there was any sin in my conduct when I was among carnal company, because I did not take any satisfaction there, but only followed it, I thought, for sufficient reasons. But still all that I did or could do, conscience would roar day and night. Doesn't that relate to the term, the demon name Ravana or something? Or Rudra, yeah. Saint Augustine and Aline both emerged into the smooth waters of inner unity and peace, and I shall next ask you to consider more closely some of the peculiarities of the process of unification when it occurs. It may come gradually, or it may occur abruptly. It may come through altered feelings or through altered powers of action, or it may come through new intellectual insights or through experiences which we shall later have to designate as mystical. However it brings a characteristic sort of relief, and never such extreme relief as when it is cast into the religious mold. Happiness, religion is only one of the ways in which men gain that gift, easily, permanently, and successfully. It often transforms the most intolerable misery into the profoundest and most enduring happiness. But a fine religion is only one out of the many ways of reaching unity, and the process of remedying inner incompleteness and reducing inner discord is a great psychological process, which may take place with any sort of mental material and need not necessarily assume the religious form. In judging of the religious types of regeneration, which we are about to study, it is important to recognize that they are only one species of a genius that contains other types as well. For example, the new birth may be away from religion into incredulity, or it may be from moral scrupulosity into freedom and license, or it may be produced by the eruption into the individual's life of some new stimulus or passion, such as love, ambition, cupidity, revenge, or patriotic devotion. In all these instances, we have precisely the same psychological form of event, a firmness, stability, and equilibrium succeeding a period of storm and stress, and inconsistency. In these non religious cases, the new man may also be born either gradually or suddenly. The French philosopher Geoffroy has left an eloquent memorial of his own counter conversion as the transition from orthodoxy to infidelity has been well styled by Mr. Starbuck. Geoffroy's doubts had long harassed him, but he dates his final crisis from a certain night when his disbelief grew fixed and stable, and where the immediate result was sadness at the illusions he had lost. I shall never forget that night of December, writes Geoffroy, Geoffroy, in which the veil that concealed from me my own incredulity was torn. I hear again my steps in that narrow, naked chamber where long after the hours of sleep had come, I had the habit of walking up and down. I see again that moon, half veiled by clouds, which now and again illuminated the frigid window panes. The hours of the night flowed on, and I did not note their passage. Anxiously I followed my thoughts. As from layer to layer they descended towards the foundation of my consciousness, and scattering one by one all the illusions which until then had screened its windings from my view, made them every moment more clearly visible. Vainly I clung to these last beliefs as a shipwrecked sailor clings to the fragments of his vessel. Vainly frightened at the unknown void in which I was about to float, I turned with them towards my childhood, my family, my country, all that was dear and sacred to me. The inflexible current of my thought was too strong. Parents, family, memory, beliefs, it forced me to let go of everything. The investigation went on more obstinate and more severe as it drew near its term, and did not stop until the end was reached. I knew then that in the depth of my mind nothing was left that stood erect. This moment was a frightful one, and when towards morning I threw myself exhausted on my bed, I seemed to feel my earlier life, so smiling and so full, go out like a fire, and before me another life opened, somber and unpeopled, where in future I must live alone, alone with my fatal thought, which had exiled me thither, and which I was tempted to curse. The days which followed this discovery were the saddest of my life. Is it Theodore, or what's the TH? Geoffroy, Nouveau, Melanges Philosophiques, second ME edition, page 83. I add two other cases of counter-conversion dating from a certain moment. The first is from Professor Starbuck's manuscript collection, and the narrator is a woman. Away down in the bottom of my heart, I believe I was always more or less skeptical about God. Skepticism grew as an undercurrent all through my early youth, but it was controlled and covered by the emotional elements in my religious growth. When I was 16, I joined the church, and I was asked if I loved God. I replied, yes, as was customary and expected, but instantly with a flash something spoke within me. No, you do not. I was haunted for a long time with shame and remorse for my falsehood and for my wickedness in not loving God, mingled with fear that there might be an avenging God who would punish me in some terrible way. At 19, I had an attack of tonsillitis. Before I had quite recovered, I heard told a story of a brute who had kicked his wife downstairs and then continued the operation until she became insensible. I felt the horror of the thing keenly. Instantly this thing, Instantly, this thought flashed through my mind. I have no use for a God who permits such things. This experience was followed by months of stoical indifference to the God of my previous life, mingled with feelings of positive dislike and a somewhat proud defiance of him. I still thought there might be a God. If so, he would probably damn me, but I should have to stand it. I felt very little fear and no desire to propitiate him. I have never had any personal relations with him since this painful experience. The second case exemplifies how small an additional stimulus will overthrow the mind into a new state of equilibrium. When the process of preparation and incubation has proceeded far enough, it is like the proverbial last straw added to the camel's burden, or that touch of a needle which makes the salt in a supersaturated fluid suddenly begin to crystallize out. In John Foster's essay on Decision of Character, there is an account of a case of sudden conversion to avarice, which is illustrative enough to quote. A young man, it appears, wasted in 2 or 3 years a large patrimony in profligate revels with a number of worthless associates who called themselves his friends, and who, when his last means were exhausted, treated him, of course, with neglect or contempt. Reduced to absolute want, he one day went out of the house with an intention to put an end to his life, but wandering a while, almost unconsciously, he came to the brow of an eminence which overlooked what were lately his estates. Here he sat down and remained fixed in thought a number of hours, at the end of which he sprang from the ground with a vehement, exulting emotion. He had formed his resolution, which was that all these estates should be his again. He had formed his plan too, which he instantly began to execute. He walked hastily forward, determined to seize the first opportunity of however humble a kind to gain any money, though it were ever so despicable a trifle, and resolved absolutely not to spend, if he could help it, a farthing of whatever he might obtain. The first thing that drew his attention was a heap of coals, shot out of carts, on the pavement before a house. He offered himself to shovel or wheel them into the place where they were to be laid, and was thus employed. He received a few pence for the labor, and then, in pursuance of the saving part of his plan, requested some small gratuity of meat and drink, which was given him. He then looked out for the next thing that might chance, and went with indefatigable industry through a succession of servile employments in different places of longer and shorter duration. Still scrupulous in avoiding, as far as possible, the expense of a penny, he promptly seized every opportunity which could advance his design, without regarding the meanness of occupation or appearance. By this method, he had gained, after a considerable time, money enough to purchase, in order to sell again, a few cattle, of which he had taken pains to understand the value. He speedily, but cautiously, turned his first gains into second advantages, retained without a single deviation his extreme parsimony, and thus advanced by degrees into larger transactions and incipient wealth. I did not hear or have forgotten the continued course of his life, but the final result was that he more than recovered his lost possessions, and died an inveterate miser, worth 60,000 lira? Is that what that... or is that euro? I think that's euros. From one angle, of the loop at the end, and the rest of except if it wasn't for the line across, it kind of looks like a... why do I not remember this? Anyways, object set letter 3 abridged. I subjoin an additional document which has come into my possession and which represents in a vivid way what is probably a very frequent sort of conversion. If the opposite of falling in love, falling out of love may be so termed, falling in love also conforms frequently to this type. a latent process of unconscious preparation often preceding a sudden awakening to the fact that the mischief is irretrievably done. The free and easy tone in this narrative gives it a sincerity that speaks for itself. Now, wasn't this in a day where you can have where $1,000 where you could get by on $1 a day, and you could $1,000 was a year was a fair wage, so 60,000 something. All right. For 2 years of this time, I went through a very bad experience, which almost drove me mad. I had fallen violently in love with a girl who, young as she was, had a spirit of coquetry like a cat. As I look back on her now, I hate her. I wonder how I could ever have fallen so low as to be worked upon to such an extent by her attractions. Nevertheless, I fell into a regular fever. Could think of nothing else. Whenever I was alone, I pictured her attractions. I spent most of the time when I should have been working in recalling our previous interviews and imagining future conversations. She was very pretty, good-humored, and jolly to the last degree, and intensely pleased with my admiration. Would give me no decided answer, yes or no. And the queer thing about it was that whilst pursuing her for her hand, I secretly knew all along that she was unfit to be a wife for me, and that she never would say yes. Well, perhaps, there was enough that could have been worked with, right? Although for a year we took our meals in the same boarding house, so that I saw her continually and familiarly, our closer relations had to be largely on the sly. And this fact, together with my jealousy of one of her male admirers, and my own conscious despising me for my uncontrollable weakness, made me so nervous and sleepless that I really thought I should become insane. I understand well these young men murdering their sweethearts, which appears so often in the papers. Nevertheless, I did love her passionately, and in some ways she did deserve it. The queer thing was the sudden and unexpected way in which all stopped. I was going to work after breakfast one morning, thinking as usual of her and of my misery, when just as if some outside power laid hold of me, I found myself turning round and almost running to my room, where I immediately got out all the relics of her which I possessed, including some hair, all her notes and letters, and ambrotypes on glass. The former I made a fire of. The latter I actually crushed beneath my heel. In a sort of fierce joy of revenge and punishment, I now loathed and despised her altogether, and as for myself, I felt as if a load of disease had suddenly been removed from me. That was the end. I never spoke to her or wrote to her again in all the subsequent years, and I have never had a single moment of loving thought towards one who for so many months entirely filled my heart. In fact, I have always rather hated her memory, though now I can see that I had gone unnecessarily far in that direction. At any rate, from that happy morning onwards, I regained possession of my own proper soul, and have never since fallen into any similar trap. This seems to me an unusually clear example of two different levels of personality, inconsistent in their dictates, yet so well balanced against each other as for a long time to fill the life with discord and dissatisfaction. At last, not gradually, but in a sudden crisis, the unstable equilibrium is resolved, and this happens so unexpectedly that it is as if, to use the writer's words, some outside power laid hold. Professor Starbuck gives an analogous case and a converse case of hatred suddenly turning into love in his Psychology of Religion, page 141. Compare the other highly curious instances which he gives on page 137 to 144 of sudden non-religious alterations of habit or character. He seems right in conceiving all such sudden changes as results of special cerebral functions unconsciously developing until they are ready to play a controlling part, when they make eruption into the conscious life. When we treat of a sudden conversion, I shall make as much use as I can of this hypothesis of subconscious incubation. Now let me turn now to the kind of case, the religious case, namely that immediately concerns us. Here is one of the simplest possible type, an account of the conversion to the systematic religion of healthy-mindedness of a man who must already have been naturally of the healthy-minded type. It shows how, when the fruit is ripe, a touch will make it fall. Mr. Horace Fletcher, in his little book called Mentaculture, relates that a friend with whom he was talking of the self-control attained by the Japanese through their practice of the Buddhist discipline said, "You must first get rid of anger and worry, but," said I, "is that possible?" "Yes," replied he, "it is possible to the Japanese and ought to be possible to us." On my way back, I could think of nothing else but the words, get rid, and the idea must have continued to possess me during my sleeping hours, for the first consciousness in the morning brought back the same thought, with the revelation of a discovery which framed itself into the reasoning. If it is possible to get rid of anger and worry, why is it necessary to have them at all? I felt the strength of the argument, and at once accepted the reasoning. The baby had discovered that it could walk. It would scorn to creep any longer. From the instant I realized that these cancer spots of worry and anger were removable, they left me. With the discovery of their weakness, they were exorcised. From that time, life has had an entirely different aspect, although from that moment the possibility and desirability of freedom from the depressing passions has been a reality to me. It took me some months to feel absolute security in my new position, but as the usual occasions for worry and anger have presented themselves over and over again, and I had been unable to feel them in the slightest degree, I no longer dread or guard against them, and I am amazed at my increased energy and vigor of mind, at my strength to meet situations of all kinds, and at my disposition to love and appreciate everything. I have had occasion to travel more than 10,000 miles by rail since that morning. The same Pullman porter, conductor, hotel waiter, peddler, book agent, cabman, and others, who were formerly a source of annoyance and irritation, have been met, but I am not conscious of a single incivility. All at once, the whole world has turned good to me. I have become, as it were, sensitive only to the rays of good. I could recount many experiences which prove a brand new condition of mind, but one will be sufficient. Without the slightest feeling of annoyance or impatience, I have seen a train that I had planned to take with a good deal of interested and pleasurable anticipation move out of the station without me, because my baggage did not arrive. The porter from the hotel came running and panting into the station just as the train pulled out of sight. When he saw me, he looked as if he feared a scolding, and began to tell of being blocked in a crowded street and unable to get out. When he had finished, I said to him, "It doesn't matter at all. You couldn't help it, so we will try again tomorrow. Here is your fee. I am sorry that you had all this trouble in earning it." The look of surprise that came over his face was so filled with pleasure that I was repaid on the spot for the delay in my departure. Next day he would not accept a cent for the service, and he and I are friends for life. During the first weeks of my experience, I was on guard only against worry and anger, but in the meantime, having noticed the absence of the other depressing and dwarfing passions, I began to trace a relationship until I was convinced that they all are growths from the two roots I have specified. I have felt the freedom now for so long a time that I am sure of my relation toward it, and could no more harbor any of the thieving and depressing influences that I once nursed as a heritage of humanity than a flop would voluntarily wallow in a filthy gutter. There is no doubt in my mind that pure Christianity and pure Buddhism and the mental sciences and all religions fundamentally teach what has been a discovery to me, but none of them have presented it in the light of a simple and easy process of elimination. At one time I wondered if the elimination would not yield to indifference and sloth. In my experience, the contrary is the result. I feel such an increased desire to do something useful that it seems as if I were a boy again, and the energy for play had returned. I could fight as readily as and better than ever, if there were occasion for it. It does not make one a coward. It can't, since fear is one of the things eliminated. I notice the absence of timidity in the presence of any audience. When a boy, I was standing under a tree which was struck by lightning and received a shock, from the effects of which I never knew exception until I had dissolved partnership with my worry. Since then, lightning and thunder have been encountered under conditions which would formerly have caused great depression and discomfort without my experiencing a trace of either. Surprise is also greatly modified, and one is less liable to become startled by unexpected sights or noises. As far as I am individually concerned, I am not bothering myself at present as to what the results of this emancipated condition may be. I have no doubt that the perfect health aimed at by Christian Science may be one of the possibilities, for I note a marked improvement in the way my stomach does its duty in assimilating the food I give it to handle, and I am sure it works better to the sound of a song than under the friction of a frown. Neither am I wasting any of this precious time formulating an idea of a future existence or a future heaven. The heaven that I have within myself as an attractive or as any that has been promised or that I can imagine, and I am willing to let the growth lead where it will, as long as the anger and their brood have no part in misguiding it. H. Fletcher, Mentaculture, or the ABC of True Living, New York and Chicago, 1899, page 26 and 36, abridged. The older medicine used to speak of two ways, lysis and crisis. Lysis and crisis, one gradual, the other abrupt, in which one might recover from a bodily disease. In the spiritual realm, there are also two ways, one gradual, the other sudden, in which inner unification may occur. Tolstoy and Bunyan may again serve us as examples as it happens of the gradual way, though it must be confessed at the outset that it is hard to follow these windings of the hearts of others, and one feels that their words do not reveal their total secret. And however this be, Tolstoy, pursuing his unending questioning, seemed to come to one insight after another. First he perceived that his conviction that life was meaningless took only this finite life into account. He was looking for the value of one finite term in that of another, and the whole result could only be one of those indeterminate equations in mathematics which end with 0 equals 0. Yet this is as far as the reasoning intellect by itself can go, unless irrational sentiment or faith brings in the infinite. Believe in the infinite, as common people do, and life grows possible again. Since mankind has existed, wherever life has been, there also has been the faith that gave the possibility of living. Faith is the sense of life, that sense by virtue of which man does not destroy himself but continues to live on. It is the force whereby we live. If man did not believe that he must live for something, he would not live at all. The idea of an infinite God, of the divinity of the soul, of the union of men's actions with God. You know, you see that red and silver symbol that I use on my channel representing that. These are ideas elaborated in the infinite secret depths of human thought. They are ideas without which there would be no life, without which I myself, said Tolstoy, would not exist. I began to see that I had no right to rely on my individual reasoning and neglect these answers given by faith, for they are the only answers to the question. Yet how believe, as the common people believe, steeped as they are in the grossest superstition? It is impossible, but yet their life, it is normal, it is happy, it is an answer to the question. Little by little, Tolstoy came to the settled conviction, he says it took him 2 years to arrive there, that his trouble had not been with life in general, not with the common life of common men, but with the life of the upper intellectual artistic classes, the life which he had personally always led, the cerebral life, the life of conventionality, artificiality, and personal ambition. He had been living wrongly and must change. To work for animal needs, to abjure lies and vanities, to relieve common wants, to be simple, to believe in God. Therein lay happiness again. I remember, he says, one day in early spring I was alone in the forest, lending my ear to its mysterious noises. I listened and my thoughts went back to what, for these 3 years, it always was busy with, the quest of God. But the idea of him, I said, how did I ever come by this idea? And again there arose in me, with this thought, glad aspirations towards life. Everything in me awoke and received a meaning. Why do I look farther? A voice within me asked, he is there, he without whom one cannot live. To acknowledge God and to live are one and the same thing. God is what life is. Well, al-hayya is the living, right? Well then, live, seek God, and there will be no life without him. After this, things cleared up within me and about me better than ever, and the light has never wholly died away. I was saved from suicide. Just how or when the change took place I cannot tell, but as insensibly and gradually as the force of life had been annulled within me, and I had reached my moral deathbed, just as gradually and imperceptibly did the energy of life come back. And what was strange was that this energy that came back was nothing new. It was my ancient juvenile force of faith, the belief that the sole purpose of my life was to be better. I gave up the life of the conventional world, recognizing it to be no life, but a parody on life, which its superfluities simply keep us from comprehending. And Tolstoy thereupon embraced the life of the peasants, and has felt right and happy, are at least relatively so ever since. And William James considerably abridged Tolstoy's words in his translation. As I interpret his melancholy then, it was not merely an accidental vitiation of his humors, though it was doubtless also that. It was logically called for by the clash between his inner character and his outer activities and aims. Although a literary artist, Tolstoy was one of those primitive oaks of men to whom the superfluities and insecurities, the cupidities, complications, and cruelties of our polite civilization are profoundly unsatisfying, and for whom the eternal veracities lie within more natural and animal things. His crisis was the getting of his soul in order, the discovery of its genuine habit and vocation, the escape from falsehoods into what for him were the ways of truth. It was a case of heterogeneous personality, tardily and slowly finding its unity and level. And though not many of us can imitate Tolstoy, not having enough perhaps of the aboriginal human marrow in our bones, most of us may at least feel as if it might be better for us if we could. Bunyan's recovery seems to have been even slower. For years together he was alternately haunted with texts of scripture, now up, now down, but at last with an ever-growing relief in his salvation through the blood of Christ. We're going to get into that quote next.